I am Karen Vancluysen. I'm the Secretary General of the Polis Network, which is a European network of cities and regions working together on sustainable urban mobility and transport innovation. And our mission is threefold. So we offer with our network a platform to cities and regions to talk to each other and learn from each other's successes and mistakes in the field of urban mobility and innovation. And also we represent their interests towards the European institutions when it comes to urban mobility issues and initiatives in that field on the European level. We also engage a lot in a dialogue with the industry and the private sector, as of course they are bringing many of the innovations to our cities and regions. And finally, we also engage a lot in European funded projects together with cities and regions. So to bring research and innovation, to bring new solutions to the local level. Micromobility has become a really hot topic over the last couple of years. And it's a term that brings together bikes, e-bikes and e-scooters. So the electrified scooters that we see in our streets, not the mopeds. And they have been on the forefront because they have been introduced more and more in shared schemes in cities run by private operators. So they bring together a number of light mobility devices, and they could help to access and to extend the offer, to improve access to and to extend the offer of sustainable urban mobility options in our cities. Today, cities are working hard to bring a modal shift away from the private car to our cities. So they want streets for people and no longer streets for cars, and they want to move towards more sustainable modes of transport in our cities. That means having public transport and active travel as the backbone of an urban mobility ecosystem. Now, micromobility can actually help to extend that offer of sustainable mobility options. We have the new modes with the e-scooters, of course, bikes and e-bikes already existed, but by offering them in the form of these shared schemes through the private operators that have been coming to our cities, we can really also make them more accessible and increase the modal share for these modes in our urban mobility ecosystem. They can also help to fill the gaps that cannot be met by public transport, for example, or they can also help to cover the first and the last urban mile that we do not cover with public transport. I'm particularly a big fan well, I am a big fan of bikes anyway, but also I'm a big fan of the e-bikes because they can really also tremendously extend the typical range of 5 kilometers that we always mention for cycling. So the distances that we can cover with an e-bike are longer, and that also makes them more interesting to cover even longer distances and even go into suburban areas, for example, so that you can use the e-bike for commuting purposes, for example. And what is also interesting is now that these e-bikes are being offered through shared schemes, it's still quite expensive to buy an electric bike, but if you can make use of them whenever useful and necessary through a shared scheme, this is of course also helping to make them accessible to a wider group of potential users. So in a nutshell, micromobility can really help to reduce car dependence in our cities and to improve multimodality and intermodality. There are a number of interesting incentives being offered by public authorities. Also, for example, the Île-de-France region, which is the region around Paris, has set up itself a rental scheme for e-bikes so that people can lease an e-bike, actually a leasing scheme, so that they don't have to buy it and that they can use it as if it were their own personal bike. And if this is then also accompanied with dedicated infrastructure, then it can be really powerful. And Île-de-France has been and is deploying long-distance bicycle routes, which actually follow the same routes as the regional public transport system, the RER. So that really allows you also, in combination with this leasing scheme, to cover these longer distances that I was mentioning. So if infrastructure and rental schemes, leasing schemes, or sharing schemes go hand in hand, I think there's still a lot of untapped potential that we can capitalize on in the future. With any innovation that is coming our way in cities, and there have been many, and they've all been coming at a very fast pace and at the same time over the last couple of years, with any of these innovations, it's very important that we regulate as public sector. If you just let these solutions deploy and you don't put any frameworks in place, we will see that there might be a number of negative externalities that come into play. So regulation can help us to maximize the opportunities that these new solutions offer, but also to mitigate those negative externalities. And if we look at the case of micromobility in particular, we see that there have been a number of problems, especially at the beginning. For example, they were cluttering urban space. There was a bit of a public outcry in the media as well that these e-scooters in particular were getting in the way of pedestrians, that they were dangerous, that they were parked illegally and everywhere, and that they were creating a big mess. Of course, it's all a matter of perspective, because if you would be asking me which vehicle the biggest polluter is of urban space, I would not be mentioning the tiny e-scooter, I would be mentioning the private car. But so some of the negative externalities and issues that we see in terms of negative use of urban space also have to do with the fact that urban space in our cities is not fairly distributed. It's still taking up, the car is still taking up way too much space in our urban environment. So I would try to turn this around and make it a positive story by using this wave of micromobility also as an opportunity to extend the space that we give to light mobility modes and active mobility modes in our cities. But the bottom line is that we need regulation in order for these privately run mobility services to positively contribute to the ecosystem, because there are other threats or possible negative consequences if we don't regulate. For example, what we also don't want to happen is an unwanted modal shift. The e-scooters and the commercial operators of e-scooters, they come with big promises and they say they will help to reduce car dependence in cities and get people out of their cars and onto more sustainable modes. And if that is happening, of course, that's fantastic and that's what we want. But what also might be happening, and that's not what cities want, is that people, for example, stop walking or stop cycling and get onto an e-scooter. And then you lose the health benefit, for example. When you cycle or when you walk, you are physically active as well. And this is also helping cities address other policy challenges in the field of health and lack of physical activity, for example. But we don't want people to stop walking and getting onto an e-scooter, because that's also not going to help the urban mobility ecosystem take a step forward, or that's not going to reduce car dependence. And you see already in the current situation that in unregulated contexts, we see unwanted nudging happening. For example, if you go to Google Maps and you ask for a walking route, they will try to nudge you towards the use of an e-scooter. And that's exactly what we don't want to see happening, of course, and that we would like to avoid. So it is true that there are some potential threats as well when it comes to micromobility, and that you have to think very carefully as a city what you want, what your public policy goals are, and how these new services could contribute to reaching those goals, but also could potentially undermine them. And then you have to step in and set some rules. The case of Paris is very interesting. So far, we see that the operators tend to go to the capital cities where they see the biggest potential business and where it's commercially the most interesting. But this also led to a situation that Paris was being flooded by e-scooters and other devices, but particularly e-scooters. And that then, because of this massive arrival of e-scooters, that was causing the problems that I mentioned before as well. But what Paris did was really go through different stages of regulating these new devices. And this goes together with trial and error. And I think this is fine. It's a new situation. We have to find out what works and what doesn't work, both from the perspective of the public sector and from the perspective of the private sector. So I think it's fine to go through the trial and error phase, and that it's even unavoidable. And we've seen how Paris has progressively upgraded and updated its regulatory framework for micromobility, and that this is now paying off. So in the final stage, or in the current stage, they decided in the end to limit the number of operators that get a permit, and also limit the number of vehicles that they thought would be adapted to the needs of the citizens, and in a way that it doesn't also overcrowd public space. And that seems to be working well now. But they've also invested themselves in terms of improving infrastructure. Paris is a very good example of a city that wants to give the streets back to the people, that is increasingly investing in infrastructure for cycling and walking, and is also, for example, committing itself as a city to providing dedicated spots for parking the e-scooters or the e-bikes, for example. So it's that way more of a partnership where they put rules on the table that the operators need to comply with, but also themselves invest in improving the infrastructure. So I think that's definitely a good example. You should always start from the local policy perspective. What is an urban mobility policy that is in place? What are the targets that you have as a city? And what are the objectives that you want to reach? And then that is always a starting point. And then you have to start looking at the different solutions that are out there and whether these solutions can help you to reach those policy goals that you have set in your local policy. And the fear of missing out is never a good reason for engaging in a certain innovation. So that should not be why we engage as a city with micromobility. But if you see that there is true potential for micromobility in helping you reduce car dependence and extending the range of options available to citizens, then it might be interesting to engage, because indeed, with e-bikes, with bikes and with e-scooters, we provide a wider offer to citizens in terms of alternatives to the car, and it might help them also to be less dependent on the car. And in some cases, we have seen examples from cities, for example, in Brussels, which has the reputation of being a car-centric city on the one hand and has many traffic jams, but on the other hand, the city has been increasingly investing as well in more infrastructure and really wants to reduce car dependence. So they really see a clear case for micromobility to help them realize those goals. And they even have an issue in some cases with a lack of capacity on public transport, especially for short distances, where they would actually welcome a shift from short public transport rides to e-scooters or e-bikes, for example, so that also some capacity is released for the longer distances that are better covered by public transport. So if we can find a way where micromobility is really filling the gaps that public transport is not addressing, and complement these gaps, then that I think is the perfect story. Also, we should be looking at new ways of public-private sector cooperation, and it might be much more beneficial for micromobility operators to help you fill those gaps than for a city to set up its own schemes, which might be very costly and not always efficient. So if we have these private sector players now anyway, we should be exploring how we can best cooperate with them and how they can complete the urban mobility ecosystem and the reduction of car dependence, the improvement of air quality, the reduction of congestion, and improving safety overall. Of course, when we talk about safety, we cannot ignore the concerns that you see as well when it comes to e-scooters. It's a new device, it's a new vehicle. Our streets are not maybe adapted to it sufficiently, and there's some concerns as well because it can be going quite fast, for example. But there again, regulation comes in, but also the need for dedicated infrastructure. If you improve your infrastructure for cyclists, and then it will also be safer for e-scooters. And if you regulate those services and, for example, limit the speed that they can have, this will also already improve safety. So there's always pros and cons, but regulation can solve many things in that respect. Within Polis, we have a dedicated platform for smaller and medium-sized cities, so we are very well aware of the specific concerns or specific issues that they are facing, which might be less the case in capital cities. It is true that for micromobility, the operators have all been focusing on the big cities because they are the most commercially interesting. At the same time, I think, and that's a message that we try to convey to the sector as well, I think there's a lot of untapped potential in smaller and medium-sized cities, and we should really work towards attracting operators to those smaller and medium-sized cities as well. They are afraid that there is no critical mass, that they need, of course, to be commercially viable. But at the same time, what you sometimes see in smaller and medium-sized cities as well is that there is a less extensive public transport supply, or a less developed public transport system, or at least not as developed as in the bigger cities. And also that that there is a higher level of car dependence, and a bigger suburban or even rural area where there are not many alternatives available. So I think there is the untapped potential that we should be looking at, but also what would be instrumental for creating a viable business case in smaller and medium-sized cities is to explore these new types of public-private partnerships, where cities could maybe partly subsidize these schemes, which is still cheaper than setting up the schemes themselves, and which would also make it then more commercially interesting for the private sector operators to roll out their services. Of course, the first condition should be that we see that there is a positive role that they can play. And we have to recognize as well that in some cases, there will be a negative answer. You see this particularly when it comes to e-scooters, that there is some reluctance in some cities. For example, cities which already have a very high modal share for cycling, typically the Danish cities or the Dutch cities. They don't see the need for bringing in this other mode, which is less active than cycling, the electric scooter. They already have a good modal share, and maybe also the car is already at a limit which they can manage. So that's the first question that you have to ask yourself. Is this a solution that will help me? And then you take the next step. But for medium-sized cities and smaller cities, the partnership dimension and the dialogue with the private sector in terms of how to come to a viable business case is really, really important. And if we look at it from that perspective, I think it can just as well work in medium-sized cities as well. If I would provide some recommendations to decision makers when it comes to engaging in micromobility solutions or not for their particular city, I would start by saying that they first need to look at what they need from a policy perspective, how micromobility can contribute to their policy goals, and maybe how it cannot contribute to their policy goals. And then in that case, you should not be afraid to decide not to engage with micromobility, or only to go for bikes and e-bikes, but not for e-scooters. That's perfectly fine as well. And it makes sense in some cases to take that decision. If then you decide to engage with micromobility, it's very important to talk to the private sector, and you need to regulate if you want to innovate. So you have to make sure that your public policy goals are put at front and center, and that the private operators align with those public policy goals. Because this is not something that happens automatically, nor naturally. Of course, they have their commercial interests at heart. As a city, you have the public interest and the sustainable mobility concerns at heart. So you have to make sure you find the right balance. You need to strike the right balance between allowing innovation to thrive, but also making sure that those innovations comply with your rules. And that's also important to avoid the negative externalities that I was mentioning before that you might have if you don't regulate these new services. What I would also like to encourage cities to do is make use of the fact that these services are inherently digital in nature. They are generating a lot of data, and a lot of interesting data, in terms of where these services are being used, but also in terms of how you can monitor them, the routes that are being taken, the trips that are being made, but also monitor their compliance with the regulations you have set, and enforcement with the rules in terms of parking, for example, or the rules in terms of zones where only pedestrians are allowed. So that data is a potential source of information, and a very rich source of information that can really inform and optimize policy and planning. I would also say that once you engage in micromobility and you embrace it, that you use this trend to finally reallocate space in cities. And we've seen during the COVID-19 crisis that there has been a massive acceleration of these trends of giving the streets back to the people, and of rebalancing the use of space in our cities. And cities are in charge of urban space, and it's a very powerful tool, because by taking away space from one mode, you can, or giving more space to another mode, you can prioritize or disincentivize certain transport modes in cities. And this is really important. So what we should really avoid is that the different light mobility modes start fighting with each other, like walking against e-scooters or cycling against e-scooters, but rather that they join forces and together fight for more space and more dedicated and safe infrastructure in the urban environment. And finally, to conclude, I would say the last message to give is indeed explore new types of partnerships, business models, and even subsidy schemes if those services help you to contribute to policy goals, because we see that currently those schemes live off their venture capital. In many cases, they don't have a commercial business case just yet. And we know that there is no easy money to be gained from sustainable mobility. So if they help you reach your goals, don't be afraid also to subsidize them. What we have been saying as well, besides looking at medium-sized cities to the industry, is don't only focus on the urban cores. There are in the urban core, in the city center, there are many alternatives already available. But in suburban areas covering longer distances, there is a less extensive public transport supply very often as well. And there's also a very severe problem when it comes to incoming car traffic into city centers. So commuters coming from outside the city, entering the city in an unsustainable way and creating problems of congestion and air pollution with their cars or unsafe situations. So if we can deploy e-bikes in shared schemes also in suburban areas, then we can really address that specific target group of commuters as well. And if then you accompany this with long distance bike infrastructure, then it really is a very powerful tool to also tackle the incoming commuter traffic and the longer distances. We see, for example, in the Netherlands that you have these super cycle highways on a regional level, which are really great infrastructure for e-bikes to get to the city in a way that is even much faster than if you would get stuck in your car in a traffic jam. So there's only benefits to that, I would say. I think we have to recognize that the role of the car in the city is going to change no matter how. There are so many negative externalities linked to car use, and cities have no choice but to tremendously reduce the use of the private car in the city center. For those cars that still remain there and where there is no alternative, we have to make sure that those cars are clean, because there's the air pollution problem and that we need to tackle. So you see also that cities are progressively introducing urban vehicle access regulations, low emission zones, congestion charges to tackle both the congestion problem and the air quality problem when it comes to car use. So they are also massively investing in electrification, electromobility. But obviously, just replacing the current number of cars by clean cars or electric cars is not going to solve the congestion problem. So in any case, we need a drastic modal shift away from the private car. And this is a trend that is coming and it's not going away. Also, what is really important to make that massive shift is to finally internalize the external costs of car traffic. All the negative externalities linked to car traffic are not reflected in the costs right now. And we need to do that. And by doing that, the alternatives will also become more attractive, because then you will really feel it also in your wallet, what the actual car is costing to society. So that will also make the sustainable alternatives more attractive and will make people think twice before they take their car. And we also hope that through mobility as a service, which is the integration of the different sustainable mobility options into one ecosystem and one app available for the user, will help to improve multimodality and intermodality. But mass on itself is also not the silver bullet or the holy grail. We can only do it by a right balance between carrots and sticks. And politicians should also not be afraid to take unpopular measures to reach that goal. It's also the right of the city to protect its own residents and citizens against those negative side effects of car traffic, also from the incoming commuters, because many of those people that are living in suburban areas are coming to the cities to work, for example. So they are causing these massive problems for the city centers and the residents in the city. So it's the right of the city then also to take action and to penalize in financial ways or discourage those polluting means of transport. And I think when people start to feel financially what the impact is of those measures, they will think twice, I hope, and start to consider alternatives.